The battle of the sexes. You've probably heard that phrase before and have taken it to mean something both literal and metaphorical. Literal in the sense that there's been this long running competition to see who the superior sex is, and metaphorical in the sense that our social lives are dominated by this us versus them mentality. Littered throughout pop culture are messages like women are emotional, or men are so stubborn, or boys will be boys, or girls like boys who are tough. If you're like me, you may have wondered, why are men and women so different? If you've done any amount of research into this question, you may have come across some explanations like men and women have different brains, or different hormone levels mean different displays of emotion, yada yada. The question I want to answer today is there any truth to this? There is a very complex relationship between human biology, psychology, and gender. It might help if we start with some basic definitions that are often confused, conflated, or otherwise just misunderstood. The two terms that get conflated most often are sex and gender. Sex is your biology, or the biological components that make up your physical body. Think chromosomes, hormones, sex characteristics, and so on. Gender is a little bit harder to define, but generally speaking, it's a socially constructed set of roles and attitudes that form part of your personal identity. Typically, we think of a man as someone who was born male, and likewise a woman as someone who was born female. When someone identifies with this gender binary, we refer to them as cisgender. For those who do not identify with this binary, we refer to them as transgender. If you're familiar with these concepts already, you might have noticed that I missed a big component of this gender binary. So let's address that now. If society has traditionally thought of there only being two genders, men and women, that suggests that there are only two sexes, right? Well, not exactly. If human biology defines sex categories, there are actually more than two. People who don't fall into this male or female category are referred to as intersex. Now, the common rebuttal here is that we shouldn't concern ourselves too much with intersex people because there are so few of them. But in fact, if you've ever come across a person with red hair, you've likely also come across a person who is intersex. Society and the medical field have traditionally treated intersex people as being defective, which explains why doctors have performed invasive and unnecessary procedures, oftentimes without the parents' approval, in an attempt to reinforce the idea that there are only two biological sexes and that living as one of those two choices would somehow improve their well-being. This idea that intersex people are somehow defective is not only insulting, it's just downright hard or impossible to clearly define. Intersex people still have sex, and many of them are capable of reproduction, so what makes them defective? If intersex people are as common as redheads, do we write off red hair as not being a legitimate hair color just because there are so few of them compared to blondes and brunettes? So while sex and gender both exist on a wide spectrum, I want to focus on the differences between men and women, since there's still a lot of research to be done on trans and non-binary people. Gender is a learned performance, and this is true of all identities. During their development, most children begin to recognize and label gender stereotypes between ages 18 and 24 months. Most often categorize their own gender by the age of 3. However, gender is a performance that is reinforced and rewarded. Boys who exhibit more feminine traits are often told to toughen up and work on their physical strength, while girls who exhibit more masculine traits are told to become more ladylike and alter their appearance to become more attractive to boys. At 5 to 6 years old, most children are rigid about gender stereotypes and preferences, but those feelings become more flexible as they age. For many people, once they've developed their gender identity, they start to look for ways to reinforce that identity and bond with those who are like them. Saturdays are for the boys, only girls allowed, am I right? To be clear here, that's not a bad thing. In fact, we do things to reinforce our sense of self in a lot of different ways. This could be for a sense of self-improvement, to find belonging within a group, etc. Where this starts to turn sour is when we lean so far into these stereotypes that we use them as a way to put others down. This is where the battle of the sexes comes into play. Have you ever heard the term men are from Mars, women are from Venus? If you have, perhaps you thought this was some ages-old adage passed down from generation to generation, but this phrase is a relatively recent phenomenon. It's actually the title of a book written by John Gray, and in this book, he makes a bold claim. Communication barriers between men and women stem from inherent differences between the two sexes, and in order to be a more effective communicator, we must be aware of these differences in order to solve those issues. Now, this doesn't seem too bad on the surface, right? The problem here is that, one, outside of obvious biological differences between men and women, there really isn't any evidence that the two are just inherently different. And two, this book has become such a meme that the ideas within have been used to reinforce what can only be considered sexist behaviors. Perhaps the most common cultural belief we have about men is that, for better or for worse, they're rougher and more aggressive than women. The reasoning behind this states that aggression is caused by the hormone testosterone, and men have higher levels of testosterone than women, therefore they're inherently more aggressive. Seems logical, right? Well, not really. Aggression is an extremely complex social behavior, and regardless of the amount of testosterone, the correlation between it and aggression is actually the same in both men and women. Furthermore, testosterone is not the only hormone involved in aggression, and the amount that these levels vary is often the result of environmental stressors, aka our hormone levels often change due to our reactions to behaviors, not the other way around. So then, men are more aggressive than women because they don't like to talk about their feelings. Men just aren't emotional beings, and that's gotta be due to their biology, right? Well, that's also not really true. Emotions are expressed using both spoken language and body language, but the more important of those two is the spoken aspect. What studies have shown is that parents use more emotionally laden language with young girls than they do with young boys, and girls are often able to express their emotions using a wider vocabulary than boys are. If you're still convinced that this is something biological, it might be easier to understand emotion as a skill, so try replacing that with another skill like mathematics. Would you expect a child who wasn't taught more advanced mathematics beyond addition and subtraction to be better at that skill than a child who was? Of course not. And I'm sure you wouldn't come to the conclusion that the child who wasn't taught much math is just inherently less intelligent than the other. It's the same thing with our emotions. You may think, well, so what? Men aren't good with emotions, what's the harm in that? We'll come back to that later. Sticking to the topic of emotions, though, we should talk a little more about societal expectations of gender performance through emotion. I'm sure the majority of people watching this would agree with the following statement. Women are more emotional than men. However, that statement just isn't true. On the contrary, men actually self-report more frequent emotional experiences than women, the majority of them being positive experiences. What research on this also shows is that women, contrary to popular belief, are not experiencing negative emotions at the hands of men. Women reporting negative emotional experiences are most often tied to their economic situations, so the whole man-hating, angry feminist stereotype doesn't really play out in the research on this subject. While again, we're focusing here on the gender expression of men and women, What this research more broadly indicates is that there's a huge disconnect between society's expectations of gender performance and people's lived experiences. Generally speaking, there are no differences between the male and female brain. Scientists still don't quite understand the complex role that hormones play in our behaviors. So then, why does any of this matter at all? 1 in 11 high school girls and 1 in 15 high school boys report having experienced physical dating violence in the last year. Girls suffer more from relationship violence emotionally and physically. They are more likely than boys to have serious injuries and report being terrified. Male victims seldom fear violence by their girlfriends and often say the attacks did not hurt or that they found the violence amusing. In data provided from the CDC, both boys and girls are more likely to be sexually abused by other boys. Over half to 3/4 of all teens report knowing others in violent relationships in school or in the community. The National Coalition Against Domestic Violence reports that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men have experienced some form of physical violence by an intimate partner, with 1 in 7 women and 1 in 25 men reporting an injury. Women have higher rates as being perpetuators of physical violence compared to contact sexual violence. Women are 10 times more likely to be victimized by an intimate partner, and overall, men are disproportionately the perpetuators of violence both against women and other men, but especially against women. Among men who are stalked, 46% report being stalked by a woman and 43% by another man. The FBI reports that the rate of false rape and sexual assault accusations is the same as for other violent crimes, less than 3%. These statistics might be alarming, and because many of our societal expectations of sex and gender are so rigid, you might be under the impression that there's not much that can be done about this problem. It might be worth noting, though, that scholars have been actively studying what causes gendered violence. An important concept to understand here is emotional intelligence, which is how we perceive, use, understand, manage, and handle our emotions. Research has indicated that those who score lower on measures of emotional intelligence have an increased propensity to be abusive. Now, I'm not saying that this is the only cause of abuse, but research seems to indicate that aside from material conditions, it is a huge component of it. Since we've already established that the idea of men and women being inherently different doesn't really hold up to scrutiny, I think it's worth exploring how our learned behaviors are reinforcing gendered violence, even if that link isn't always clear. Many of the messages that we receive from popular culture about what makes men and women different not only ignores science, it's rooted in patriarchal beliefs that promote and celebrate male domination, especially male domination of women and other trans femmes. So I ask of you, the viewer, what are some of the sources you think influenced your gender and gender expression? When you watch people debate about men and women's differences, do you believe them? Why? To anyone watching this who is a parent, I beg of you, consider how harmful the reinforcing of gender stereotypes can be. If your child is expressing their gender in a way that doesn't conform to your idea of who they are, think back to your childhood and remember what your parents instilled in you. Did you like it when they told you to wear your hair a certain way? To dress in certain styles and colors? To play with certain toys? To act and speak in certain ways? Did your parents force you to live up to the ideals of being a man or woman? What did that mean for your relationship with them? To any young person watching this, embrace who you are. You might feel like you fit in really well with others, or maybe you feel a bit different. Either way, there's only one you, and you only have one life, so spend your time being yourself. Throughout your life, you'll be told how to act, what to wear, how to speak. People will look at you and tell you that you don't fit into their box. People out there will be mean, they'll call you names, they'll tell you to cut your hair, They'll tell you that boys can't wear nail polish or that girls shouldn't play in the mud. Ignore them. They're wrong. If the people telling you this are your parents, be patient with them. Times are changing and hopefully they'll come around, but if they don't, just know that there are people out there who love and accept you just the way you are. You don't have to label yourself if you don't want to or are unsure of what your labels might be. Just remember to be yourself. So no, men aren't from Mars and women aren't from Venus. We're all from Earth, and we will share this planet until the day we take our last breath. In the battle of the sexes, we're both losing. So let's put down our weapons and let down our guards. We aren't so different after all.